The dust swirled across the horizon as Margaret Rose clutched the creased letter in her trembling hands, the stagecoach beneath her rattling over the uneven terrain of the California Trail. At 22 years of age, she was traveling farther from her Boston home than she'd ever imagined possible, toward a future husband she knew only through 6 months of correspondence. It was April 1872, and the promise of a new life in San Diego beckoned her westward. Margaret adjusted her bonnet, tucking a stray strand of chestnut hair behind her ear, as she reread the latest letter from Mr. Henry Wilkins, the widower who had advertised for a bride in the Boston Matrimonial News. His penmanship was neat and deliberate, much like the man himself seemed to be from his descriptions a successful merchant with a sprawling ranch on the outskirts of the growing coastal town. How much farther to San Diego? Margaret asked the driver as they stopped to water the horses at a small stream. The weathered man spat tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. "Still a good 3 days, miss, if the weather holds. Got to make it through these mountain passes first." Margaret nodded, her stomach tightening with anxiety. The other passengers, a middle-aged couple and an elderly gentleman, had disembarked at the previous stop, leaving her alone for the remainder of the journey. She clutched her carpet bag close, containing the few possessions she'd brought from her former life. Some dresses, her mother's silver hairbrush, a Bible, and the letters. After her parents died of influenza the previous winter, leaving her with mounting debts and no prospects, Margaret had made the difficult decision to become a mail-order bride. Mr. Wilkins' advertisement had seemed respectable, his letters thoughtful. He offered security, if not romance. At her age, with no family connections or fortune, it was more than many women could hope for. As the stagecoach continued its journey, the terrain grew increasingly rugged. Massive rock formations rose on either side of the narrow trail, creating a natural corridor that seemed to Margaret both majestic and menacing. The driver had grown quieter, his eyes scanning the path ahead with evident concern. "Don't like the look of those clouds," he muttered, more to himself than to Margaret. "Might be in for some trouble." No sooner had he spoken than a low rumble echoed through the canyon. Margaret gripped the edge of her seat as the first raindrops began to fall, quickly transforming into a torrential downpour. "Hold tight, miss," the driver shouted over the din of the storm. The horses whinnied in panic as he struggled to maintain control of the increasingly slippery path. The rumbling grew louder, and Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs. Looking up at the cliff face, she watched in horror as small stones began to cascade down the mountainside. The driver cursed, whipping the horses into a frenzy as he tried to outrun the danger. "Jump!" he screamed suddenly. "Jump now!" Margaret barely had time to register his words before the driver leaped from his perch. Instinctively, she threw herself from the stagecoach, tumbling painfully onto the muddy ground just as a deafening roar filled the air. The world seemed to collapse around her, as rocks of all sizes crashed down the mountainside. She scrambled desperately on hands and knees, seeking shelter beneath a small outcropping as the full force of the rockslide engulfed the stagecoach. The horses' terrified screams were abruptly silenced. In the chaos, Margaret lost sight of the driver, and a sickening feeling washed over her at what his fate might have been. For what felt like an eternity, Margaret huddled beneath the outcropping, her body shaking uncontrollably as rocks continued to fall. When the deluge finally slowed to occasional pebbles, she cautiously peered out at the devastation. The stagecoach was almost completely buried, only a corner visible beneath the rubble. There was no sign of the driver or the horses. "Hello?" She called weakly, her voice barely audible even to herself. Clearing her throat, she tried again. "Hello, is anyone there?" Only the patter of rain answered her. With growing dread, Margaret realized her precarious situation. She was alone in the wilderness, miles from San Diego, with night approaching and the storm continuing to rage. Worse, as she attempted to move, a sharp pain shot through her right leg. Looking down, she saw with horror that her lower half was trapped beneath fallen debris, not the largest boulders, thankfully, but enough smaller rocks to effectively pin her in place. "Help!" she shouted into the empty canyon, her voice echoing mockingly back to her. "Please, someone help me." The rain eventually subsided, but darkness fell quickly in the mountains. Margaret's throat grew raw from calling for help, and her trapped leg throbbed with pain. She managed to reach her carpet bag, which had landed nearby in her desperate leap from the coach, and withdrew her shawl for warmth. The night was cold, and occasional shivers of pain and fear ran through her body. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the strange sounds of the wilderness and the constant discomfort of her position. By morning, Margaret's situation had grown dire. Her mouth was parched, her trapped leg numb, and the reality of her circumstances settled on her like a physical weight. "I will not die here," she whispered to herself, summoning what little strength remained. "I will not." Throughout the morning, she tried to free herself, pushing and pulling at the rocks that held her captive. But each movement only seemed to settle the debris more firmly around her leg, and she eventually stopped for fear of causing a further slide that might crush her completely. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. Margaret's light bonnet provided little protection, and soon her face and neck burned from exposure. Her lips cracked from dehydration, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. As afternoon approached, her calls for help grew weaker, and despair began to creep into her heart. It was then that she heard the distant sound of a horse's hooves against the rocky ground. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks, conjuring sounds of rescue from desperation. But the rhythm grew steadier, closer. "Help!" Margaret cried with renewed vigor. "Over here, please help me." The hoofbeats stopped, and for a terrible moment she feared the rider had turned away. Then came the sound of boots on gravel, and a man's voice called out, "Hello, someone there?" "Yes." "Here, under the rocks." Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. A figure appeared at the edge of the rockslide, tall and broad-shouldered against the bright sky. He scanned the area before his eyes landed on Margaret, partially concealed beneath the outcropping and debris. "Good Lord," he murmured, quickly making his way toward her, navigating the unstable ground with practiced ease. As he drew closer, Margaret could see him more clearly, a man perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the sea before a storm. His dark hair fell in waves beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and several days' worth of stubble covered his jaw. He wore the practical clothes of a working man, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and denim trousers tucked into scuffed boots. "Madam, are you badly hurt?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "My leg is trapped," Margaret replied, embarrassed by the tears that sprang to her eyes at the sight of another human being. "I can't move it." He nodded, assessing the situation with a quick, practiced glance. "Name's Matthew Vega. I've got a ranch about 10 miles north of here." "Margaret Rose," she replied. "I was on the stagecoach to San Diego when the storm hit." Matthew's expression darkened. "The driver," Margaret shook her head. "I don't know. He jumped, but I lost sight of him when the rocks came down." "Let's worry about getting you free first," Matthew said pragmatically. "Then I'll look for others." He removed his hat and gloves, setting them aside. "This might hurt some, Miss Rose. I'll try to be gentle, but these rocks need moving." Without waiting for her response, he began carefully shifting the smaller rocks away from her trapped limb. His hands, though calloused from hard work, moved with surprising gentleness. When he reached the larger stones, he paused to study the arrangement. These are precariously balanced. If I move the wrong one first, the others might shift down harder. He met her eyes. I need to do this right. Margaret nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. I trust you, Mr. Vega. Something flickered in his eyes at her words, but he quickly returned his attention to the task. Positioning himself carefully, Matthew began to dig around the rocks with his bare hands, creating space to grip the largest stone. When I lift this, he instructed, try to pull your leg free if you can. Ready? Margaret braced herself, gripping the ground beneath her. Ready. With a grunt of effort, Matthew lifted the boulder. Muscles strained visibly through his shirt as he held the massive weight. Margaret tried to move her leg, but pain shot through it like fire. I can't, she gasped. It hurts too much. Sweat beaded on Matthew's forehead as he continued to hold the rock. One more try, he urged through gritted teeth. I've got it stable now. Summoning all her courage, Margaret pulled again, crying out as her leg finally slid free. Matthew immediately let the boulder drop, then quickly moved to her side. Let me see, he said, gently examining her leg. Though her skirts were torn and dirty, he maintained a respectful distance, touching only what was necessary to assess her injury. Doesn't appear to be broken, but it's badly bruised. Can you move your toes? Margaret concentrated, relieved when her toes responded. Yes. Good sign. He sat back on his heels. You're lucky, very lucky. Thanks to you, Margaret said softly. Matthew shook his head. I just happened by. Anyone would have done the same. He stood, dusting off his hands. Let me check for the driver, then we need to get you somewhere safe. Night comes quick in these mountains, and we're still a ways from any town. He searched the area systematically, climbing over the rockslide to the other side where the stage coach lay crushed. After several minutes, he returned, his expression grim. Found him, Matthew said quietly. He didn't make it, must have been hit by the first rocks that came down. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, a prayer forming silently on her lips for the man whose name she didn't even know. What about the horses? She asked. Gone too, Matthew confirmed. Nothing to be done for any of them now. He knelt beside her again. Can you stand if I help you? I think so. Matthew supported her carefully as she attempted to put weight on her injured leg. Pain radiated from ankle to hip, but it was bearable with his strong arm around her waist. My things, Margaret remembered suddenly, gesturing to her carpet bag. Matthew retrieved it, looking around for other belongings. Is that everything? Margaret thought of her trunk filled with the modest trousseau she'd prepared for her new life, now buried somewhere beneath tons of rock. Yes, she said quietly. That's all. My horse is just over the ridge, Matthew explained as they slowly made their way across the uneven ground. He's sturdy enough to carry us both back to my ranch. It's the closest shelter around these parts. But I need to get to San Diego, Margaret protested weakly. Someone is waiting for me there. Matthew gave her a sidelong glance. Family? Margaret hesitated. Not exactly. I'm a mail-order bride. My intended, Mr. Henry Wilkins, is expecting me. Something unreadable flickered across Matthew's features. Wilkins can wait another day or two. You need rest and medical attention, and my ranch is a lot closer than San Diego. Too exhausted to argue, Margaret nodded. When they reached Matthew's horse, a powerful chestnut gelding with a white blaze down its face, he helped her mount before swinging up behind her. Lean back if you need to, he said, his breath warm against her ear as he reached around her for the reins. It's about an hour's ride. As they set off, Margaret found herself inevitably pressed against the solid warmth of Matthew's chest, his arms creating a secure bracket around her. Despite her circumstances, or perhaps because of them, she felt safer than she had in months. The journey passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion for Margaret. Matthew kept the horse at a steady pace, clearly mindful of her injuries. He spoke occasionally, pointing out landmarks or asking if she was comfortable, but mostly they rode in silence through the rugged landscape. The sun was setting when a modest ranch house came into view, nestled in a small valley with mountains rising behind it. A barn stood nearby, along with corrals containing several horses. It wasn't large, but everything appeared well maintained. "Home," Matthew said simply as they approached. An older man emerged from the barn as they rode in, his weathered face creasing with concern when he spotted Margaret. "Tomas," Matthew called, "we have a guest in need of help." The man hurried forward as Matthew dismounted, then carefully lifted Margaret from the saddle. "Miss Rose was caught in that rockslide we heard yesterday," Matthew explained. "Her stage coach was destroyed." "Dios mío," Tomas murmured. "The poor señorita. I will tell Alina to prepare a bed." "Thank you," Matthew said, carrying Margaret toward the house with seemingly effortless strength. To her, he added, "Tomas and Alina Mendoza have worked this ranch with me since I inherited it from my uncle 5 years ago. They're good people." The ranch house was modest but welcoming, with simple, sturdy furniture and clean, swept floors. Alina, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked black hair, gasped when Matthew carried Margaret inside. "Put her in the spare room," she instructed, hurrying ahead to prepare the bed. "I will bring hot water and bandages." Margaret found herself settled onto a narrow but comfortable bed in a small, neat room. Alina shooed Matthew out before helping Margaret remove her torn and dirty traveling dress, replacing it with a clean nightgown that smelled of sunshine and lavender. "The señor, he found you under the rocks?" Alina asked as she gently washed the dirt from Margaret's face and hands. "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "Mr. Vega dug me out with his bare hands. I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't come along." Alina nodded knowingly. "He is a good man, our Mateo. Strong, yes, but gentle too." She examined Margaret's injured leg, applying a pungent-smelling salve to the worst of the bruising. "This will help with the pain. You are fortunate no bones are broken." "How long until I can travel again?" Margaret asked anxiously. "I need to reach San Diego. Someone is waiting for me." "A few days of rest, at least," Alina said firmly. "The body must heal. Now you need food and sleep." Margaret wanted to protest, but found she lacked the energy. Alina soon returned with a tray bearing a bowl of hearty stew, fresh bread, and a cup of hot tea. The simple meal was the most delicious thing Margaret had tasted in days, and she ate every bite before sinking back against the pillows, overcome with exhaustion. As sleep claimed her, Margaret's last thoughts were of Matthew Vega's strong hands carefully freeing her from the rocks, and the surprising gentleness in his storm-colored eyes. Morning brought sunlight streaming through the small window, and the distant sounds of a working ranch. Margaret awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the ache in her leg reminded her. She sat up cautiously, testing her mobility. A knock at the door preceded Alina's entrance with a tray of breakfast and a bundle of clothing. "Good morning, señorita," the older woman greeted her cheerfully. "I have brought you something to eat and some clothes. They belonged to Mateo's sister when she visited last summer. They may be a little large but cleaner than your torn dress." "Thank you," Margaret said sincerely. "You're very kind. How is your leg today?" Alina asked, setting down the tray. Margaret moved it experimentally. "Still painful, but better than yesterday." "Good, good, the bruises will fade." Alina helped her dress in a simple blue cotton dress that indeed hung somewhat loosely on Margaret's frame. "Mateo asked if you feel well enough to join him for lunch later. He has questions about your journey." "Of course," Margaret agreed. though anxiety fluttered in her chest at the thought of explaining her situation more fully to the handsome rancher. After breakfast, with Alina's assistance, Margaret ventured out onto the small covered porch, settling into a rocking chair with a quilt across her lap despite the warmth of the day. From this vantage point, she could observe the activities of the ranch. Matthew and Tomas were working with the horses in a distant corral, their movements deliberate and practiced. Margaret found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Matthew. Even from a distance, there was something compelling about the way he moved, confident but never harsh, especially with the animals. When he removed his hat to wipe his brow, the sun caught in his dark hair, giving it an almost blue-black sheen. Around midday, Matthew approached the house, washing up at the pump before climbing the porch steps. He'd changed his shirt, Margaret noticed, and had attempted to tame his hair. "Miss Rose," he greeted her with a slight nod. "You're looking better today." "Thanks to your hospitality, Mr. Vega," she replied, "and please call me Margaret." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Margaret, then, and I'm Matthew." He took the chair beside hers, stretching his long legs out before him. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, looking out over the ranch. "It's beautiful here," Margaret observed. "So different from Boston." "Boston," Matthew raised an eyebrow. "You've come a long way." "Yes." Margaret smoothed the quilt over her lap. "After my parents died last winter, there was little left for me there." Matthew studied her face, his expression softening with understanding. "So you answered an advertisement." It wasn't a question, but Margaret nodded anyway. "Mr. Wilkins seemed respectable in his letters. He owns a mercantile in San Diego and a small ranch outside the city." "I know of him," Matthew said, his tone carefully neutral. "Our paths have crossed on occasion." Before Margaret could ask what he thought of her intended, Alina appeared with a tray of food: cold chicken, bread, cheese, and apples. "Eat," she instructed them both. "Talking can wait until stomachs are full." They obeyed, and Margaret found herself relaxing in the simple pleasure of a good meal shared in comfortable company. Matthew ate with the hearty appetite of a man who worked hard, but his manners were impeccable. When they finished, Alina cleared away the dishes, leaving them with cups of coffee. "I need to send word to Mr. Wilkins about what happened," Margaret said, returning to practical matters. "He'll be worried when the stage coach doesn't arrive." Matthew nodded. "Tomas is riding to town tomorrow for supplies. He can telegraph San Diego with news of the accident and your whereabouts." "Thank you." Margaret hesitated. "I should also inquire about the next available transportation. I don't wish to impose on your kindness longer than necessary." A flicker of something disappointment crossed Matthew's face before his expression settled back into polite neutrality. "The stage runs through Riverdale twice a week. Next one would be Tuesday, 4 days from now." "That seems like the best option," Margaret agreed, though the thought of leaving the safety of the ranch made her unexpectedly anxious. "If my leg is healed enough by then. And if not, there'll be another stage the following Friday," Matthew added. He seemed about to say more when a shout from the corral drew his attention. "Excuse me," he said, rising quickly. "One of the new colts is giving Tomas trouble." Margaret watched as he strode across the yard, his whole demeanor changing as he focused on the task at hand. There was something captivating about seeing him in his element, confident, capable, at home in this rugged landscape. Over the next 2 days, Margaret's strength gradually returned. Her leg, though still discolored with bruises, supported her weight well enough for short walks around the ranch house. She insisted on helping Alina with household tasks, partly out of gratitude and partly to distract herself from thoughts of the journey still ahead. Matthew was often busy with ranch work, but he made time each evening to sit with her on the porch, sharing stories of the area and listening attentively to her tales of Boston life. Margaret found herself looking forward to these quiet conversations more than she cared to admit. On the third evening, as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Matthew broached a subject they'd both been avoiding. "Tomas returned from town with a reply to the telegram," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "From Wilkins." Margaret's heart quickened. "Oh. What did he say?" Matthew hesitated. "He expressed relief that you survived the accident and said he'll expect you on Tuesday's stage. He'll meet you at the station in San Diego." "I see." Margaret wasn't sure why the brief, practical response left her feeling slightly hollow. What had she expected? Declarations of concern, offers to come retrieve her personally. She barely knew the man. "Margaret," Matthew began, then paused as if choosing his words carefully. "What do you know about Henry Wilkins?" She turned to look at him, surprised by the question. "He's 42, a widower with no children. His wife died 3 years ago. He owns a successful business and seems to be well respected." Matthew nodded slowly. "All true enough." "But," Margaret prompted, sensing his reservation. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not my place to speak ill of another man. Please," Margaret urged. "I'm traveling hundreds of miles to marry him. If there's something I should know." Matthew's expression grew troubled. "Wilkins is indeed a successful businessman. He's also known for being exacting in his expectations. His first wife was a local girl. There were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Margaret asked, her throat suddenly dry. "That he wasn't always kind to her," Matthew said quietly. "Nothing that could be proven, and she never complained. But she rarely appeared in public during their last year together, and when she did, she seemed diminished somehow." Margaret's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "Perhaps she was ill. He wrote that she died of fever." "Perhaps," Matthew conceded. "I'm only telling you what I've heard, Margaret. It may all be unfounded gossip." They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Thank you for your honesty, but I've made my decision and I have little choice but to honor it. Mr. Wilkins paid for my passage west. We have an agreement." Matthew turned to face her, his expression intensely serious. "There are always choices, Margaret." Before she could respond, Elena called them in for dinner, ending the conversation but not the thoughts swirling in Margaret's mind. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, replaying Matthew's words and examining her own feelings. The truth was, in just a few days, she had come to enjoy Matthew Vega's company far more than she should his quiet strength, his gentle manner with both animals and people, the rare but transformative smile that lit his entire face. But what future could there possibly be in such feelings? She was promised to another man, a man who had given her the opportunity for a new beginning when she had nowhere else to turn. By morning, Margaret had resolved to maintain her course. She joined Elena in the kitchen, learning to make tortillas while trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest at the thought of leaving the ranch the following day. Matthew was absent for most of the day, having ridden out at dawn to check on a distant section of his property. When he returned late in the afternoon, his expression was grim, and he went directly to confer with Tomas near the barn. "What's happened?" Margaret asked Elena, watching through the window as the men engaged in serious conversation. Elena shook her head. "Perhaps trouble with the North Pasture again. There has been dispute over that land with the Blackwell Ranch for years." Before Margaret could inquire further, Matthew entered the kitchen, removing his hat respectfully. "We have a problem," he announced without preamble. "There's been another rockslide on the road to Riverdale. The stage won't be coming through tomorrow, or likely for at least a week, until they can clear the path." Margaret absorbed this news with mixed emotions, relief at postponing her departure warring with anxiety over the delay in meeting her intended. "Is there another route to San Diego?" Matthew nodded. "Several, but none served regularly by the stagecoach. The closest alternative would be to ride to Junction City, about 30 miles south. They have a regular stage connection to San Diego." 30 miles, Margaret echoed, dismayed. Her injured leg, though improving, would never withstand such a journey on horseback. "I could take you in the wagon," Matthew offered, "but it would be a rough 2-day trip over difficult terrain." "Perhaps it is a sign from God that you should rest longer," Elena suggested, crossing herself. "The road will clear in time." Matthew and Margaret exchanged a long look, something unspoken passing between them. "There's no rush," he said quietly. "You're welcome here as long as needed." That evening they once again found themselves on the porch, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. The air between them seemed charged with possibilities, with words unsaid. "I should send another telegram to Mr. Wilkins," Margaret said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence, "to explain the delay." "Tomas can ride to town again tomorrow," Matthew agreed. After a pause, he added, "Margaret, about what I said regarding Wilkins." "It's all right," she interrupted. "You were only trying to be honest with me, and I appreciate that. But my situation remains unchanged. I came west to marry him, and that's what I must do." Matthew turned in his chair to face her directly. "Must you? Really?" The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "What alternative do I have? Return to Boston with no money and no prospects. Stay here indefinitely as your charity case." "Not charity," Matthew said, his voice dropping lower. "Never that." Margaret's heart began to race as she realized what he might be suggesting. "Matthew, we barely know each other." "I know that you're brave," he countered. "I know you're kind to Elena and Tomas, that you love watching the sunrise over the mountains, that you laugh with your whole being when something truly amuses you. I know your hands are gentle but strong, that you're determined to make your own way in the world despite its cruelties." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "What else do I need to know?" "This is madness," Margaret whispered, though she made no move to leave. "Perhaps," Matthew agreed. "Or perhaps finding you trapped beneath those rocks was the most sensible thing that's ever happened to me." Before Margaret could respond, a distant rumble of thunder broke the moment. Matthew glanced at the sky, where clouds were now obscuring the stars. "Storm's coming," he observed, rising from his chair. "We should go in." As if summoned by his words, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. They retreated indoors just as the first heavy drops began to fall. "Good night, Margaret," Matthew said as they paused in the hallway between their rooms. "Think about what I said." As if she could think of anything else. Margaret lay awake long into the night, listening to the rain pounding on the roof and wrestling with her conflicted heart. By morning, the storm had passed, but Margaret's inner turmoil had not. She rose early, slipping outside to watch the sunrise as had become her habit. The world seemed washed clean by the rain, colors more vibrant in the clear light of dawn. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Matthew approach until he spoke. "You're up early." Margaret turned, struck anew by how handsome he was in the golden morning light. "I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I." He moved to stand beside her, both of them looking out over the rain-freshened landscape. "I want to show you something today if your leg is strong enough for a short ride." "I think it would manage," Margaret said, curious despite herself. After breakfast, Matthew saddled 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a gentle mare for Margaret. With Matthew's assistance and some adjustment of her borrowed dress, she managed to mount side saddle. They rode slowly, Matthew setting a pace that wouldn't strain her healing leg. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked as they followed a narrow trail leading away from the ranch. "Somewhere special," was his only answer, a mysterious smile playing at his lips. They rode for perhaps half an hour before the trail opened onto a small, hidden valley. A crystal-clear stream ran through its center, lined with willows and wildflowers. The mountains rose protectively on all sides, creating a perfect natural sanctuary. "Oh," Margaret breathed, enchanted by the secret paradise. "It's beautiful." Matthew helped her dismount near the stream, where he'd laid out a simple picnic: bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a bottle of wine. They sat on a blanket spread over the soft grass, the horses grazing contentedly nearby. "I found this place my first year here," Matthew explained. "I come here sometimes when I need to think clearly, away from the demands of the ranch." "And you've never shown it to anyone else?" Margaret asked, sensing the significance of the gesture. "No one," he confirmed. "Until you." They ate in companionable silence, occasionally commenting on the butterflies dancing among the wildflowers or the playful splash of fish in the stream. It was only when they'd finished that Matthew broached the subject that hung between them. "I meant what I said last night," he began, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I know it seems sudden, perhaps even foolish, but I've never been more certain of anything." Margaret swallowed hard, her heart racing. "Matthew, I'm promised to another man." "A man you've never met," he pointed out gently. "A man who knows you only through letters, who hasn't bothered to come looking for you after a disaster that might have claimed your life." "That's unfair," Margaret protested, though without much conviction. "He doesn't know exactly where I am, and he has responsibilities in San Diego." "And if you were my intended," Matthew said, moving closer on the blanket, "no responsibility would have kept me from finding you, from seeing with my own eyes that you were safe." Margaret's breath caught as he reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "This is happening too fast," she whispered. "Sometimes life gives us only moments to recognize what's truly important," Matthew replied. "I never expected to find you, Margaret. I was riding home from Junction City when I heard what I thought might be a cry for help. I almost didn't investigate, almost convinced myself it was just the wind." "But you did investigate," Margaret said softly. "And found you," he finished. "Trapped but not defeated, injured but still fighting." In that moment, digging through those rocks with my bare hands, I knew I'd move mountains for you if necessary. Margaret's eyes filled with tears at the raw honesty in his voice. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider staying," Matthew urged. "Not as my guest or my charity case, but as a woman making a choice about her own future." Before she could respond, a distant gunshot echoed through the valley, startling them both. Matthew was on his feet instantly, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip that Margaret hadn't even noticed he was wearing. "What was that?" she asked, alarmed. Matthew's expression had grown grim. "Trouble. We need to get back to the ranch." They packed up hurriedly, and Matthew helped Margaret onto her horse. They rode back at a faster pace than before, Margaret gritting her teeth against the pain in her leg as they hurried along the trail. As the ranch came into view, Matthew cursed under his breath. 3 unfamiliar horses were tied outside the house, and Tomas was standing rigidly on the porch, facing a well-dressed man whose back was to them. "Stay behind me," Matthew instructed as they approached. Margaret nodded, sudden fear gripping her heart. The stranger turned as they rode into the yard, and Margaret felt a jolt of recognition even though she'd never seen his face before. There was no mistaking who this must be. Henry Wilkins had come to claim his bride. He was a distinguished-looking man of medium height with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His clothes were expensive, his bearing confident to the point of arrogance. As his eyes found Margaret, his expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Miss Rose," he said, his voice as controlled as his appearance, "I see the reports of your survival were accurate." Matthew dismounted, then helped Margaret down, his hands lingering protectively at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. The gesture was not lost on Wilkins, whose eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Wilkins," Margaret acknowledged, suddenly acutely aware of her borrowed dress and wind-blown hair. "This is unexpected. When I received word of another rockslide delaying your journey further, I decided to take matters into my own hands," Wilkins explained smoothly. "I've brought a carriage and 2 men to escort us safely back to San Diego." Matthew stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Margaret and Wilkins. "Miss Rose is still recovering from her injuries, Mr. Wilkins. The journey might be too taxing." Wilkins smiled thinly. "I appreciate your concern, Vega, but this is a matter between me and my fiancée." His gaze returned to Margaret. "I've made arrangements at a respectable inn in Junction City for tonight. We can continue to San Diego tomorrow at a leisurely pace." Margaret's mind raced. Everything was happening too quickly. She glanced at Matthew, seeing the tension in his jaw, the concern in his eyes. Then she looked at Wilkins, the man she had agreed to marry, the man who offered her security and respectability. I need a moment to gather my things," she said finally, buying time to collect her thoughts. "Of course," Wilkins agreed magnanimously. "I'll wait here." Elena met Margaret at the door, her face lined with worry. "Come, child," she said, leading her inside. Once in the bedroom, Margaret sat heavily on the bed, her hands trembling. "I don't know what to do, Elena." The older woman sat beside her, taking Margaret's hands in her weathered ones. "What does your heart tell you?" "That's just it," Margaret said desperately. "My head tells me to honor my commitment to go with Mr. Wilkins, who has paid for my journey and offered me a secure future. But my heart—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the tumult of emotions she felt. "The heart knows truths the head cannot see," Elena said gently. "Mateo looks at you the way my Tomas still looks at me after 40 years. That is rare, Nina, very rare. But what if it's just infatuation? We've known each other less than a week." Elena smiled knowingly. "Some souls recognize each other instantly. Others take years to see what is before them. Time is not always the measure of true feeling." Outside, voices were rising, Matthew and Wilkins, their tones increasingly hostile, though the words themselves were indistinct. Margaret rose, moving to the window where she could see the 2 men facing each other in the yard, Tomas standing tensely nearby while Wilkins' men lounged against their horses, watching with detached interest. "I need to stop this before it escalates," Margaret said, gathering her resolve along with the few possessions she'd brought or been given during her stay. Elena nodded, embracing her quickly. "Remember, Nina, courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." When Margaret emerged onto the porch, both men turned toward her expectantly. The tension between them was palpable, like the charged air before a lightning strike. "Miss Rose," Wilkins said smoothly, extending his hand toward her, "shall we depart? The day grows late, and we have some distance to cover before nightfall." Margaret descended the steps slowly, acutely aware of Matthew's intense gaze following her movement. When she reached the yard, she stopped, standing between the 2 men but belonging to neither. "Mr. Wilkins," she began carefully, "I appreciate you coming all this way to escort me to San Diego. It was considerate of you." Wilkins smiled, satisfaction evident in his expression. "It was the proper thing to do." "Now, if you'll allow my man to take your bag, please let me finish," Margaret interrupted, drawing a surprised look from Wilkins and a flicker of hope in Matthew's eyes. Your offer of marriage gave me hope when I had none left in Boston. For that, I will always be grateful." Wilkins' smile faltered slightly. "There is no need for such formality between us, my dear. We can discuss everything on the journey home." "That's just it," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as her resolve solidified. "I won't be making that journey with you today." A tense silence fell over the yard. Wilkins' expression hardened, all pretense of warmth vanishing. "I don't understand. We have an agreement, Miss Rose. I paid for your passage west." "Yes, you did," Margaret acknowledged, "and I will repay that debt in time." "But I cannot marry you, Mr. Wilkins." "Cannot or will not?" Wilkins demanded, a dangerous edge entering his voice. "Both," Margaret replied firmly. "I entered our arrangement in good faith, believing it was my only option. I've since discovered that isn't true." Wilkins' gaze flicked to Matthew, who stood watching silently, and back to Margaret. "I see," he said coldly. "Vega has turned your head with pretty words and wilderness adventures. How charming." "This isn't about Mr. Vega," Margaret insisted, though the flush in her cheeks perhaps betrayed her. "It's about making a choice that's right for me." "A choice?" Wilkins laughed harshly. "You're a woman alone in the world, Miss Rose. Your choices are limited by that reality." "What exactly do you imagine will happen now?" "That you'll stay here, playing frontier wife to a man who digs in the dirt for a living." Matthew took a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides, but Margaret held up a hand to stop him. This was her battle to fight. "What I do next is my concern, not yours," she said calmly. "I'm sorry if I've inconvenienced you truly, but I would rather face an uncertain future than a certain mistake." Wilkins stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as if chewing on words too bitter to speak. Finally, he turned to one of his men. "Bring the carriage around. We're leaving." To Margaret, he said coldly, "You'll regret this decision, Miss Rose. The West is not kind to women without protection." "She has protection," Matthew said, speaking for the first time since Margaret had emerged from the house. The simple statement contained volumes: a declaration, a promise, a challenge. Wilkins looked between them once more, his expression contemptuous. "Enjoy your rustic idyll while it lasts." He tipped his hat with mocking civility. "Good day, Miss Rose." The trio mounted their horses, the carriage left seemingly forgotten in their haste to depart. As they rode away, dust rising behind them, Margaret felt both relief and trepidation wash over her in equal measure. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked quietly, moving to stand beside her. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I've just turned away the security I traveled across the country to find. It seems rather foolish when said aloud." "The bravest actions often do," Matthew replied, cautiously taking her hand in his. "Margaret, what I said earlier today, I meant every word. But I want you to know that there's no obligation here. You're welcome to stay at the ranch as long as you need to decide what you want next, whatever that might be." Margaret looked up at him. This man who had literally dug her out from beneath crushing rocks with his bare hands, who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect from the moment they met. In his eyes she saw not possession or entitlement, but something far more precious: hope, tempered with the willingness to let her choose freely. "What I want," she said softly, "is time. Time to know you better, time to be sure of my own heart." Matthew's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Time I can give you," he promised, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and heart-stoppingly sincere. From the porch, Elena and Tomas exchanged knowing looks, silently agreeing to give the young couple a moment of privacy. Over the weeks that followed, Margaret found herself settling into life at the Vega ranch with surprising ease. Her leg healed completely, allowing her to take on increasingly active roles in the daily running of the household. Elena taught her to cook traditional dishes, while Tomas showed her how to tend the vegetable garden that supplied much of their food. Matthew was true to his word, never pressing for declarations or commitments, yet making no secret of his growing feelings for her. They spent evenings on the porch talking about everything and nothing, his childhood as the son of a Spanish father and Irish mother, her dreams of someday opening a small school, their shared love of reading. Sometimes they rode together to the secret valley, which Margaret now thought of as their special place. Word came from Junction City that Henry Wilkins had spread unpleasant rumors about Margaret's character before returning to San Diego. But the local community, who held Matthew in high regard, paid little heed to the gossip. Instead, they welcomed Margaret warmly when Matthew brought her to town for Sunday services or occasional social gatherings. As summer progressed into autumn, Margaret found work teaching at the small schoolhouse in Riverdale, riding in with Matthew 3 days a week. The modest salary allowed her to begin repaying her debt to Wilkins, sending carefully documented payments to his business address in San Diego. It was on a crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant hues of orange and gold, that Matthew finally asked the question that had lingered between them. "Are you happy here, Margaret?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. She turned to look at him, this man who had become the center of her world in ways she could never have imagined when she first embarked on her journey west. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Matthew reached for her hand, his touch warm and familiar now. "I've been thinking about building an addition to the house. Another bedroom, perhaps a proper sitting room. The ranch is doing well this year, we could afford it." "That sounds lovely," Margaret said, wondering where his thoughts were leading. Matthew took a deep breath. "Before I make plans, I need to know, do you see your future here, with me?" Margaret's heart swelled with emotion. After months of growing closer, of learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, dreams and fears, the question felt not sudden but inevitable, the natural culmination of a journey that began beneath a rockslide. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." The joy that transformed Matthew's face was answer enough, but he spoke anyway, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you, Margaret Rose. I think I've loved you since I pulled you from those rocks and saw the courage in your eyes even through your pain." "And I love you," she replied, the words feeling both momentous and perfectly natural. "Not because you rescued me, but because of who you are every day, since kind, honorable, patient." Matthew slipped from his chair to one knee before her, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he confessed, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant gold ring set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's. Will you marry me, Margaret?" Tears of happiness filled her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Matthew Vega." "With all my heart, yes." They were married on Christmas Day, 1872, in the small church in Riverdale, with Elena and Tomas standing proudly as their witnesses, and the entire community joining in the celebration. Margaret wore a dress of ivory silk that the women of the town had helped her make, with sprigs of winter berries in her hair instead of a veil. As they exchanged vows, Margaret thought of the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment, how a terrifying rockslide had ultimately led her not to disaster, but to the greatest blessing of her life. When Matthew kissed her for the first time as her husband, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. The addition to the ranch house was completed just in time for Margaret to share the news that they would need the extra room She was expecting their first child by late autumn. Matthew's joy at the announcement was boundless, and he took to talking to her growing belly each night, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and promises of adventures to come. Their son, William Thomas Vega, was born on a clear November morning in 1873, with Alina serving as midwife and Matthew pacing anxiously until the first strong cries filled the room. When Matthew held his son for the first time, the look of wonder on his face brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes. "He's perfect," Matthew whispered, gently touching the dark wisps of hair that promised to be as thick and unruly as his own. Just like his mother, life settled into a new rhythm with William's arrival. Margaret continued teaching part-time, often bringing the baby with her to the delight of her students. The ranch prospered under Matthew's careful management, allowing them to hire additional help that gave them more time together as a family. As William grew from infant to toddler, the love between Margaret and Matthew deepened, strengthened by shared joys and challenges. They still rode occasionally to their special valley, now bringing their son to splash in the stream and chase butterflies among the wildflowers. On a warm summer evening in 1876, as they sat on the expanded porch of their home watching 3-year-old William attempt to mimic Tomas's guitar playing, Matthew squeezed Margaret's hand. "You ever think about it?" he asked quietly. "How different our lives would be if there hadn't been a rockslide that day? If I hadn't heard your call for help?" Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, her free hand resting on the gentle swell of her second pregnancy. "Sometimes. But then, I remember what Alina told me once, that some souls recognize each other instantly. I believe we would have found each other somehow, Matthew, perhaps not as dramatically, but just as inevitably." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I would have dug through the entire mountain with my bare hands to find you," he murmured. "And I'd do it again every day for the rest of our lives if needed." "Fortunately," Margaret replied with a soft laugh, "all you need to do now is love us. That's miracle enough for me." As the sun set behind the mountains, they both loved, painting the sky in colors no artist could capture. Margaret Rose Vega thanked God for rockslides and brave cowboys and second chances, for all the unexpected detours that had led her not to the life she'd planned, but to the life she was meant to live. Their family continued to grow and flourish in the years that followed. After William came a daughter, Catherine Alina, born in the winter of 1876, and later another son, James Matthew, in the spring of 1879. The Vega Ranch expanded along with their family, becoming one of the most prosperous in the region thanks to Matthew's innovative ranching methods and Margaret's careful bookkeeping. The schoolhouse in Riverdale eventually grew into a proper school, with Margaret serving as head mistress once the children were old enough to attend. She never forgot her journey west or the twist of fate that had changed her destiny, and she made a point of teaching her students and her children that sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as disasters. On their 30th wedding anniversary, as they stood together in the secret valley that had witnessed their first declarations of love, Matthew presented Margaret with a locket containing a small, smooth stone. "What's this?" she asked, opening the delicate gold case. "A piece of the Rockslide," he explained, his eyes still as blue and intense as the day they'd met, though now crinkled at the corners from years of laughter and sun. "I kept it all these years as a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unlikely places." Margaret closed her fingers around the locket, thinking of all they had built together from such improbable beginnings: a family, a home, a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. "Who would have thought," she said softly, That being trapped beneath a mountain would lead me to everything I never knew I wanted. Matthew pulled her close, his arms still strong and sure around her. "I thank God every day for leading me to you," he whispered against her hair, now threaded with silver but still as beautiful to him as it had been in her youth. And as they stood there together, surrounded by wildflowers and memories, with the sound of the stream providing a gentle backdrop to their embrace, both knew with absolute certainty that some loves truly are strong enough to move mountains, or at the very least, to dig through them with bare hands and unwavering hearts.